If you want to replace your job paycheck, you need to stop thinking like an employee and start thinking like an owner of cash flow machines. That is the whole game. A job pays you because you show up. The day you stop showing up, the machine stops. Most people call that security because it arrives every 2 weeks. I have never thought of it that way. I think of it as dependence. It is a fine form of dependence while you are building. It is a dangerous form of dependence if you never move beyond it. What you actually want is not only wealth. You want a set of assets that keeps paying you whether you wake up and go to work or not. That is a completely different objective. And once you understand that, a lot of the normal investing advice stops being enough. People love to say, just buy the S&P 500 and wait, fine, I own broad market exposure too. But the S&P 500 is mainly a wealth building tool. It is not by itself an income replacement tool unless the pile has already become enormous and you are willing to sell pieces of it to live. That is not the same thing as having assets that naturally throw off cash. If you make $80,000 a year from a job, then the real freedom question is not, how big is my account? The real question is, how much annual cash flow can my assets produce without me dragging my body into a building 5 days a week? That is the right question. And that is why I want to walk you through 5 asset categories that can help answer it. Not because any one of them is perfect, not because any one of them will save you overnight, but because together they teach you the real structure of financial independence. I am going to start with the easiest and work toward the hardest because that is the honest order. The easiest is treasury exposure. When you buy treasury bills, notes, or bonds, you are lending money to the United States government. Treasury Direct is the official government platform for buying and holding treasury marketable securities directly, and the interest from treasury bills, notes, and bonds is subject to federal income tax but exempt from state and local income taxes. That matters because a lot of people compare treasury income with bank account interest and forget that the tax treatment is not exactly the same. Now, what do I like about this? I like the clarity. I like the fact that you know exactly what kind of machine you bought. You did not buy growth. You bought income. You bought a stream of interest. And for many people trying to escape paycheck dependence, that kind of boring reliability is far more useful than another exciting asset that promises the moon and mostly delivers anxiety. The problem with treasuries is not that they are bad. The problem is that they are limited. They generally do not grow your principal in the way a great business or a good equity fund can. They pay you interest on the money you already have. That is it. So if you lend $100,000, you get interest on $100,000. But the $100,000 itself is not a magically compounding upward because the machine is designed for income, not expansion. That makes treasuries a wonderful first layer. It does not make them the whole answer. And there is one more thing you need to remember. The income changes with the rate environment. If the Federal Reserve cuts rates and short-term yields fall, the income from short-duration treasury exposure usually falls with it. So you are not buying a permanent lifestyle solution. You are buying a high-quality stream that reflects the current level of rates. That is still useful. Just understand what you own. Now, if you do not want to buy treasuries directly, you can use a treasury ETF as a wrapper around the same idea. A fund like SCOV gives you very short duration treasury exposure in ETF form, which can make the mechanics feel easier. That does not make it a growth asset. It simply makes the same basic machine easier to hold and more convenient to manage for many people. The second category is dividend, paying ETFs. This is where the machine starts becoming more interesting because now you are not just lending money to the government. You are owning pieces of businesses that earn profits and send some of those profits back to owners. That is a much more powerful concept. A business can keep paying you while also growing the value of the underlying asset if the economics are strong enough. That is why I like dividends when they come from quality. Now, of course, you could buy one company, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, a utility, a bank, a pipeline. Plenty of businesses pay dividends. But owning one company means you are making one concentrated bet. Management could get worse. Debt could get heavier. Competition could intensify. The dividend could be cut. You might still be right, but you need to be willing to do the work. Most people do not want that assignment. That is why dividend ETFs are such a useful bridge. They give you access to a basket of dividend-paying companies rather than forcing you to marry one of them. Now, I think about this in 3 slices. The first slice is U.S. dividend ETFs. A fund like Noble focuses on dividend aristocrats, companies in the S&P 500 with long records of raising dividends. That is less about chasing yield and more about buying quality and consistency. A fund like SAG is broader in a very useful way. Schwab's own page recently showed SAG with a 30-day SEC yield in the low 3% range and a trailing distribution yield a bit above that. Again, I do not want you fixating on the decimals. The more important point is the kind of businesses inside the fund. The yield is only part of the story. The real story is whether the companies producing that income are strong enough to keep doing it and potentially grow it over time. That is why I would rather own a slightly lower yield backed by stronger businesses than chase a giant payout backed by weak ones. The second slice is international dividend ETFs. This is where the source text made a useful point. The world is bigger than the United States. Some foreign companies pay strong dividends, and some foreign markets may have more room to grow than parts of the U.S. market, simply because they start from a lower base. A fund like VIMI gives you diversified international high dividend exposure. A fund like IDV is another route. These can broaden your income map beyond the United States, and that matters more than people think. If you are trying to replace a paycheck, it makes sense to me that your cash flow machine should not rely entirely on one country. Now, international income comes with its own headaches, currency movements, political risk sector concentration, different corporate cultures, different governance standards, so I do not treat international dividend funds as a free lunch. I treat them as a useful expansion of the machine. The third slice is REIT ETFs. This is where people make some of their worst mistakes because they see a fat yield and lose all discipline. Real estate investment trusts can be excellent income tools, but you must understand the difference between equity REITs and mortgage REITs. An equity REIT owns property. A mortgage REIT owns mortgage exposure. Those are not the same species. A fund like VNQ gives you broad exposure to property. Owning REITs. That is one kind of machine. It is rooted in actual buildings and rental economics. A fund like REM is much more aggressive because mortgage REITs are more tied to leverage, financing spreads, and the plumbing of the credit markets. That is why the yields look so different. And this is where I want you to become smarter than the average yield. Chaser a higher yield does not mean a better investment. It often means a riskier underlying machine. If the machine is weak, the principal can fall and the payout can get cut right when you are depending on it. That is why I never want yield to be the only thing you look at. Income without durability is just a trap with better marketing. The third major asset class is direct real estate. Now we are moving beyond ETF wrappers and into actual hard assets. This is where I have always understood why wealthy people love real estate. A good rental property can put money in your pocket every month, give you control over a real physical asset, let you participate in appreciation, and offer tax treatment that labor income rarely enjoys. That is a powerful combination, but I need to tell you the truth. Real estate is not passive, the way the internet pretends it is. It can become more passive. It is not born passive. You buy a property and now you have taxes, insurance, maintenance, management, repairs, vacancy, tenants, turnover, and all the ordinary annoyances of real life. That does not mean it is bad. It means it is not a fantasy. Now let us talk about the numbers the right way. Suppose you buy a property for $200,000 and it rents for $2,000 a month. Beginners immediately get excited because they multiply $2,000 by 12 and tell themselves they are making $24,000 a year. That is not income. That is raw material. Real income starts after property taxes, insurance, maintenance, vacancy, management, repairs, and the other expenses that reality always introduces. What matters is what is left. If all that leaves you with $10,000 a year in real cash flow and you bought the property all cash for $200,000, then you are getting a 5% cash on cash return. Now, is 5% good? That depends on you. The source text said that would not be enough for the speaker, and they would want something more like 7%. I understand that instinct completely. Once you factor in work, illiquidity, and friction, I also think direct ownership needs to pay you more than a fine, return to feel worthwhile. That is the discipline of real estate. You do not get rich from gross rent. You get rich from what survives reality. Now, the reason wealthy people keep coming back to real estate is not only the cash flow, it is also the tax code. Residential rental property is generally depreciated over 27.5 years under IRS rules. That means the tax system lets you deduct a portion of the building's value every year as if it were wearing out, even while the market value of the property may be holding steady or even rising. Then on top of that, you still have the universe of ordinary and necessary business expenses that can reduce taxable income further. This is why real estate can look almost magical from the outside. You can have real cash flow and still have tax deductions that soften or erase much of the reported income. That is not cheating. That is simply one of the reasons the tax code favors ownership over labor. And if you understand that, real estate becomes much more than a property. It becomes a tax-efficient cash flow machine. The fourth asset class is a business. This is where things become both far more difficult and far more interesting. A business is not just an asset, it is a profit engine, and profit is different from wages. If you are an employee, you get paid because you work. If you are an owner, whatever is left after the expenses belongs to you. That is why business ownership can be such an extraordinary path to replacing a paycheck, because you are no longer just selling hours. You are capturing the residual value of a machine. Now let me also say something that people hate hearing. Business is hard. A lot of people see the upside and forget the reality. They see the owner collecting profits and forget the years of friction, mistakes, hiring problems, software headaches, customer headaches, margin compression, lawsuits, competition, fatigue, reinvestment, and all the other brutal little things that make real businesses real. That is why I respect business ownership so much, and that is also why I do not recommend it casually. You can build a business, you can buy a business either way. You are not buying a dividend. You are buying responsibility. That responsibility can one day become a beautifully self-sustaining machine that pays you well beyond anything a job could have done. But before that, it may ask more from you than any ETF ever will. That is why I think business ownership belongs on this list, but not at the top for most people. It has massive upside. It also demands that you become someone capable of operating it. The fifth asset class is private credit or peer-to-peer lending. This is where you essentially become the lender. Instead of lending to the U.S. government, you lend to another person or operator who needs capital. Maybe it is tied to real estate, maybe it is tied to a personal loan, maybe it is tied to a business project. The yields here can be much higher than treasuries. That is what attracts people. Good, it should attract them. Then it should make them very cautious, because a high interest rate is not a gift, it is compensation for risk. If somebody is willing to pay you 10%, 12%, 15%, or 18%, the first question should not be, how do I get more of this? The first question should be, why are they paying this much? And what happens when they cannot pay me at all? That is the right question. Private credit can be excellent for the right person, but the right person understands collateral. The right person understands legal priority. The right person understands default and recovery. The wrong person only understands that the number is bigger than the treasury yield. That is how people lose money while feeling smart. Right up until the moment they realized the collateral was weak, the borrower was sloppy, and the loan documents were not as protective as they imagined. Now let me pull all of this together. Treasuries are the easiest and cleanest income machine. Dividend ETFs are the simplest way to own a basket of businesses that can pay you over time without forcing you to analyze one company at a time. Direct real estate gives you cash flow, a hard asset, and tax advantages, but it demands work and judgment. Business ownership gives you access to real profit streams, but only if you are strong enough to build or operate the machine. Private credit can throw off strong cash flow, but only if you respect the underwriting and understand that yield is not free money. That is the map. And once you see the map, the real lesson becomes obvious. There is no perfect asset. There is only a portfolio of machines that can together produce enough cash flow that your labor stops being the only engine in your life. That is why I never want people watching a list like this and asking only, which one should I pick? That is the wrong question. The better question is, which sequence should I build? Maybe you start with treasuries because you need a stable first layer. Maybe you add dividend ETFs because you want equity income and some growth. Maybe later you buy one carefully chosen rental. Maybe much later you buy or build a business. Maybe private credit becomes a sleeve when you have the experience and balance sheet to handle it. That is a real plan, because replacing a paycheck is not one move. It is a redesign of your balance sheet, and it is not easy. The source was right about that. This does not happen overnight. It takes money. It takes sacrifice. It takes refusing to spend every raise. It takes turning present income into future machines. Most people do not fail because the math was impossible. They fail because they wanted the freedom figure without the years of disciplined design it takes to build it. That is the uncomfortable truth. A paycheck replacement plan is not really about one amazing investment. It is about using your working years to build enough cash, flowing assets, that your work is no longer the only thing keeping your life running. That is what freedom really is. Not mansions, not sports cars, not vanity. Freedom is waking up and not having to do things you hate simply because the bills demand it. That is why I love income producing assets when they are used intelligently. Not because yield is exciting, because optionality is priceless, optionality in how you spend your day, optionality in how much nonsense you tolerate, optionality in whether your time belongs to you or to whoever signs the paycheck. That is what these 5 assets are really about. They are not just investments, they are potential machines for buying back your time. And if you build them carefully, patiently, and in the right order, one day you do not just have a portfolio, you have a life that is much less dependent on your labor. That is a very different kind of wealth. And in my experience, it is a much more valuable one.